Yeah, some of you may have met me before. You may have come down to the Parisi Speed School that is in Hendersonville, or was in Hendersonville. So I'm a strength and conditioning coach. What I do is basically applying all the scientific principles that you guys go through during like all your coursework. So I'm here to kind of help you make a little bit more sense of it, try to teach you a little bit how to apply some of those things. Because when you start looking at, this thing's gotta be on first. There we go. I'm gonna come back to that. But when you start looking at all of this stuff, making sense of all the training plans, periodization, stuff like that, and then how to actually put all this into use can get a little murky. Am I teaching 6 times over the next 2 weeks? Is that what it is? Yeah, great, fantastic. I knew it was 5 or 6, right? So I'm going to put these at the beginning of every slide just because every person that does anything practically is going to have some sort of bias, right? I come from an Olympic weightlifting background. So I work with people that compete in the sport of weightlifting. I work with people that compete in the sport of powerlifting. And then obviously I work in sport performance with a lot of people I work with. So a lot of things that I have done, and when we talk about periodization today, is based on linear periodization. So basically we're going to kind of go over like step methods and things like that, because I like to see how it's really well organized and how it tracks over time. But there's more than one way to skin a cat, so we're going to kind of go over a lot of the main ones. So this is basically what we look at when we look at linear periodization or like annual training plans. You guys went over like mesocycles, you went over like macrocycles, things like that, yeah? Okay, so just kind of reviewing that, right? Like most people have their annual training plan. So annual training plan can be a year. If you're working in Olympic sports, that's going to be a quad, right? So that's going to be a 4-year process and kind of looking at that. That's why you see that big macro cycle that spans almost the whole thing, because if you have an annual training plan of 4 years, your year becomes your macro cycle. So that's one of the big things to think about. You have a prep period, you have competition periods, transition periods, depending on how many times a year you compete, depends on how many transition periods you have. So this is, you can literally like read the slide. It's pretty simple when that comes into just like knowing different cycles. When we look at doing some of these things in actual application and getting into some of the weeds, that's where we start to see linear periodization pop up, right? And so this is the most common form of implementation for just general exercise, for sport performance, any kind of like stuff you do in a weight room, or if you're working on the field doing speed and agility work, you're going to see a lot of this, right? And basically, you kind of have that initial like jolt, right? So we have a training like jolt, or like the stimulus as they call it. I literally just like to call it a shock, because basically we're going to shock the system. You see a little bit of a dip in performance, you see an increase, and then you see a drop off, right? Ultimately, our goal with periodization is to try to time everything up to be at that peak. A little bit harder than actually said. Was it easier said than done is the phrase? Yeah. So being able to time things up here, there's a lot of factors that go into it, which is why we'll get into some of the other random different styles of periodization that we'll get into. But for the most part, we can pretty much predict over time, using a regular periodization scheme, how we can shock the body, introduce a stimulus, cause an adaptation, and have it ready to compete, right? So a couple different ways that we can apply this, right? So most periodization schemes are going to follow this model, right? This is probably the most basic. This is going to be, you guys gone over like sets and reps for like hypertrophy and strength and stuff like that? Yeah? Okay, cool. I tried to look at the schedule. I like totally. So when we look at most training plans, right? So this is from a book called Periodization Training in Sport. So AA is what they call anatomical adaptation. I like to just think of it as straight up hypertrophy work. So building muscle mass. When we build muscle mass, we kind of change the tendon qualities. So basically how much elasticity or how much strength a tendon can have. Then we transition into a max strength phase. We convert the strength to power, and then we peak for a competition or a season. So you have two different approaches that are right here, and it just depends on what you're training for, right? So everybody's like, is everybody athletes in here? Yeah? For the most part. He's shaking his head. He's like, no. He's the
token non-athlete.
Hey, well, I appreciate that.
I don't want any more. I'm retired.
Retired. There it is, right? What sport? Softball. So do you have a spring and like spring and fall season?
Yes.
Okay.
Spring. For some seasons I played spring, summer, fall.
Okay. So yeah, year-round sports has kind of thrown this into a whack, which is why we'll get into undulating. But if you look at a lot of college sports, if you look at a lot of Olympic sports, they have two primary seasons, 1 to 3 main competitions a year. So you'll see these two main approaches. You have a single peaking approach. This can be any total number. So if you see the numbers here right up above, this is the number of weeks they're going through, at least in this example, in this chart. It's the number of weeks they're going through each phase of adaptation. When we look at anatomical adaptation, you're looking at your hypertrophy work, so it's going to be a lot of higher rep work. It's going to be a lot higher volume. It's going to be a lot lighter in terms of total weight, but you might see some things where you train to failure. It's also probably one of the shortest phases that you're going to have over everything because the body responds to hypertrophy pretty well. If you're eating enough and you're being at least not a jerk with your diet and you're just sitting there like not chugging beers and stuff on the weekends. I know this is like a Presbyterian college, but you're college students, let's be real. Okay? She's like, yeah, okay. But anatomical adaptation happens pretty quick. You've got that meal plan, you're eating a caloric surplus. We don't need to spend a whole ton of time doing that. It's also a great way, so when we look at anatomical adaptations and hypertrophy work, it builds an aerobic base because high volumes, you're gonna have lower rest sets, and you're gonna have a little bit more cardiovascular work just from the fact that your body's having to pump blood and keep you going throughout a training session. Then we get into max strength work, and so this is where a lot of people get caught up, is a lot of people hang out in the max strength phase for a really long time. Obviously, it's the one that's listed up longest. When we look at power, right, and if we really look at what's going to make dominant athletes or really fully functional human beings, it's power outputs, which is force times distance divided by time. So a lot of people get caught up on the force thing, which is max strength. Because it's really, really easy to track. We have a lot of ways that we can test max strength, right? You can move the maximum amount of weight, you can do body weight tests, things like that, that's gonna show you a little bit more of your max strength. And so a lot of people tend to spend a lot of time on that. Power outputs, trying to basically move less weight fast is the way I like to think about it. And then you go through these maintenance phases or conversion phases, and then you continue to train. You can do this twice a year, you can do it once a year, it just depends, right? If you look at this bottom example, and you have these prep phases, right? So we have anatomical adaptation, then we have 7 weeks of max strength, we convert to power, anatomical adaptation. That whole bottom thing, that's a 2-season cycle, or a spring and fall, if you really look at it. Could be a summer, winter, just depending on where seasons line up, right? My background a little bit in sport performance is wrestlers, and so a lot of their school, and if they compete in the school season, happens from November to February, and then a lot of their Olympic style sport, because the US doesn't compete Olympic style wrestling all year round, they compete in all of those styles from May to August. So we use a lot, personally I use a lot of this because it helps prevent injury, but then it also has them going. Just like I said, Olympic sports are going to be really weird and going to follow that a little bit more. So step methods, and this is where we actually get into actual application. This is the stuff that I probably feel a little bit better talking about. So when we look at step methods, when we look at trying to create the most adaptation, basically everything looks like a step. So we start at a lower point, we increase either volume or intensity, increase it again, and then we drop it back down to let the body recover, right? So if we went back to that initial wave, shock the body sees a decrease in performance, it comes up, and then it drops back down, right? So we're basically trying to ride that wave. We shock the body, it comes back up, it starts to dip down, we shock it with something new, it comes back up, and so we get this nice wave over time. But, you know, and that's one of those things, there's a lot of different ways to do it, right? So there's a couple different ways that you'll see these loaded. So this is basically what they consider higher low intensity or volume days, right? And we're going to kind of go into more of these in the next slide. But when we look at doing step methods, there's step methods over weeks. So your week 1 might be pretty low. Your week 2 has a bit more moderate either intensity or volume. Week 3 is pretty high. Week 4 is pretty low. That's a pretty standard 4-week step cycle. You do it within a week 2, depending on how many days a week you train, right? Like, and this is the one that makes it really interesting because nobody's going to train 7 days a week. It's just, it's a bad idea, but then 2, nobody really has time for that, especially if you're in a sport. How many play more than 1 game a week? Yeah, only 3 of you? Wow. Track, soccer. Track. Okay, that makes sense. You only compete once a week. Yeah. But you're never going to have all that, especially if you're working with athletes. You have to think about practices and everything like that. You're not going to hit the weight room or like the field for speed and agility work 7 days a week. So you're going to have these higher volume, right? And this one, they kind of give you, this is a volume one, right? It looks almost identical to intensity. So when we look at the way that we can use this info, right? And so this is going to be week outline. We'll go back, we'll hit day outlines, kind of following this. When we look at a 4-week mesocycle, so that could be an anatomical adaptation, that could be a max strength phase. A lot of people use this first example up in the top left. They kind of use what we call like an intro, a build, like 2 building weeks, and then a deload. It fits really, really nicely in a month. So being able to kind of have like a baseline level of N, you increase the intensity or volume the second week, you increase the intensity or volume the third week, and then you drop it back down below baseline levels. The body gets to recover a little bit, and you can kind of consistently make it, trying to think of like a good way. You can consistently make progress that way. Now, if we were to say, and we can kind of repeat this cycle, right? So let's just say we've got that top left one. We'll go back to that. 1 intro, 2 build, 1 deload. You can repeat that over and over again, right? So if I were to say, hey, we're going to go week 1, and let's just say we're going to do a total number of 100 reps of working weight throughout a session, and I'll kind of go into that in a second. But let's just say we did 100 reps. Well, week 2, we're going to do 150. Week 3, we're going to do 175, right? We kind of build a step, and then week 4, we're coming back down. We're going to do 75 working reps throughout a session, okay? That's just like a baseline. If we were to do it with intensity, might say we're doing 75% on week 1, 80% on week 2, 80% on, did I say 80% for week 2? Okay, 85% for week 3, and then come back down to 75 or maybe even 70% for week 4. You can do it in 6 weeks. That's another way to do it. Some people like to do this. Right now, I'm actually toying around with a bit more of this with one of my athletes. Granted, depending on who you're working with, depending on what level they're at, if you're looking at training ages, if you're looking at experience in training, this is going to be more advanced individuals. This is people that have a higher training age. Because one, they're going to need a bigger shock. They're going to need a bigger stimulus to make some kind of adaptation. They're going to need a little bit more intensity. They're going to need a little bit more volume. And it's going to take them a little bit longer to adapt because they've had a longer period of time to make those adaptations. I'll use myself as an example because I just finished up a 6-week training block. I use myself as like a guinea pig. It was the most miserable 6 weeks of my life, but it had some great results when we went back and tested things at the end. Which the farther you go in something, right? What do you run in track?
100, 200.
100, 200. What do you run in 100?
400.
Oh, 400.
Yes.
Okay, so what do you run? You said 200, 400?
Yes.
Okay, so what do you run in the 200?
20.8.
20.8. How hard was it to get from 21.2 to 20.8? It was pretty hard, wasn't it? Yeah, right? 20.8 is a pretty fast 200, right? So being able to sit there and look at how do we progress from being good to better, right? For Usain Bolt to run 100 meters in like 9.6 to 9.58 took him like 4 years, right? So if we look at that, your more advanced athletes are going to need some longer mesocycles. But for most people that you're going to encounter, 4 weeks tends to be enough, okay? So this is a little bit better of a breakdown across 8 weeks, across 6, depending on how you want to do this, right? So this is an example of 2 back-to-back mesocycles. One of them is based off of working reps, which is the volume. One of them is based off of intensity, okay? You could actually stack these on top of each other, depending on the individual you have or the team that you have and kind of the relative training age across the group. But just to kind of give you an example, because not all this is, it's all going to be very individual to what you're working with. Volume across the first week could be 100 reps. And when we talk about 100 reps, we're talking about not necessarily your warm-up sets, but we're looking at the working weights you do. So if I do 5 sets of 5 at 75%, and let's just say we do it a bench press, because it's a pretty standard example. Everybody knows the bench press. Okay, if I do 5 sets of 5 on a bench press at 75%, well, I have 25 working reps there. Let's just say I did 5 sets of 5 on a barbell row right after that, and I have 50 total working reps, okay? So your total volume that accumulates up, you could have 100 working reps. You could have 150 on your second week. You increase it even to 175 in week 3. So you've kind of built up into this nice little step up the stair kind of method. You come back down to 75 reps in the fourth week just to let the body recover a little bit. Then you can go straight back into the second week and go into 125 reps. And then you go to 175 reps. Then you go to 200 reps. And then you come back down to 100 reps, right? So you kind of have that up and then let the body recover a little bit. Now, the other way we can do this is intensity, right? So when we look at either perceived efforts, right? So you guys have done like the RPE on like the VO2 max and everything like that, okay? Who did the VO2 max test in here? Did they do it?
Did you guys? Yeah.
You did it? Yeah, did you get to the point where it's like you want to die?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's an RPE 9 or 10. You can base things off of the rating of perceived exertion. If you test a 1 rep max, that tends to be a bit more utilized, at least in performance training. But if you have people that have no experience, I'm going to be very honest, I think it's just a terrible idea. But that's largely because if you've never been into a weight training environment, if you've never been into just straight up sprinting, if you're doing like a sprint plan, right? If you came out of COVID, right, just straight up quarantine, haven't done anything in 10 weeks, do you want to do a full out effort sprint?
No, you took an effort.
Yeah, right? Right? Look at the NFL right now. If anybody pays attention to football, they've had, I don't even know how many ACL injuries at this point, and the hamstrings injuries that they're having is crazy, right? So we start pretty low, right? So if we're looking at the weight room environment, 60%, right? This could literally be an anatomical adaptation deal right here, but we could do 3 sets of 10 at 60%, right? And the next week we could increase to 70%. The week after that, 75%. Deload it down, we come down to 65%, okay? The next week we go up to 72%. So all of a sudden it's like we start a little bit higher than where we were on week 1, all right? Go up to 80%, 85%, come back down, okay? So, is this the one? Yeah. So this is an example of one of my weightlifters. So I basically took her program and at least took the main working intensities out of it, right? So you can see it. Is anybody familiar with Olympic weightlifting, right? Snatches, clean and jerks, back squats, okay? So everything is all based off of that intensity. Now, this is somebody that has a training history of about 8 years. So she's been in a weight room for about 8 years, and she's been doing the Olympic lifts for about 2 years, okay? So, and this is one of those individuals that's like, you're gonna see you have a higher starting point, so just as you're going through this, note that. But the first week we did 75% on what we call a pause snatch, right? So it's just a snatch variation. We did a back squat up to 85% for sets of 3. The next day we did 75% on the clean and on the front squat. On the jerk we did 80%, okay? So we broke it out into a couple different movements. Wednesday we went back down to 60% on a snatch. We went down to 80% on what we call a snatch bounce, just a different variation. Thursday we went to 65%. Now when you see things like 110%, certain, depending on what you're looking at, like if you start reading into training philosophies, if you're using eccentrics, so depending on the type of muscle contraction, we'll get into it when we talk about power, speed, agility, stuff like that. We'll talk about triphasic training. But when we look at stuff like 110%, that can still be based off of things that move. So if you see 100% or 110% on a clean pull, it's based off of a lighter max than what normally is actually capable of. So it's halfway between a clean and a deadlift. Third week, or the end of the week, right, everything's 75%. We rest, we recover. The next week, right, we increase the squat by 5%. We do nothing with the snatch. The second day, we increase, I increased the volume on that one a little bit, right? So we increased the total number of reps that we did. So you can kind of mix that, right? And that's the one thing that everything's an experiment. And this is where education comes in, because we go over all this stuff because there is no set answers. I probably should have gone over that at the beginning, but there are no set answers to everything. What you have is the information that you know, anatomy, physiology. We'll kind of get into a little bit more in depth of this stuff next week on Wednesday. I was literally working on the PowerPoint back there. But when we look at applying all this, you're going to see some differences. But basically we have an increase of about 5% on some movements. Other movements stay flat loaded. The next week, right, all of a sudden we see 80% on our snatches. We see 85% staying flat on our squats. Or some of our pulls, right? So if we had 110, now 115%, okay? We still got our rest, but on this fourth week, we deload, okay? Coming back down to 70, coming back down to 85 or 80% on certain movements. And that's just a very simple up, down, okay? Now, if you were to look at this person's training program now, because now that we've gone through a lot of this stuff, we went through 2 months of this after quarantine, basically a very basic plan. She's now on a 6-week cycle. And that is where we kind of can see a little bit more steady increase and then come back down, okay? Now, we can't talk about periodization, we're talking about this guy, right? Looks like he came out of a prison. So that's Louis Simmons. Anybody heard of Louis? Nobody? Anybody seen the Netflix documentary West Side versus the World? No, okay. So this is the founder of West Side Barbell. It's probably the most exclusive strength training facility in the world. But Louis popularized undulating periodization. So if you've ever seen people squat with bands, people squat with chains on the bar, you can thank Louis. So Louis took a big issue with this. So I took this from one of y'all's last charts, but as we get closer to competition, right, we have a training stimulus, your overall level of fitness goes down as you get closer to a competition, right? So we move from a very general physical preparedness. The closer you get to a competition, your body starts to lose its general fitness and goes towards a more specific fitness, okay? Anybody read the book Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell? Man, they don't read. Oh, yeah. Right? This is...
They don't have time.
They'll tell you, yeah, see. They do have a lot of class. We'll give it to you, okay? Successful people don't live at the top of the bell curve. We'll just put it that way, okay? So being able to perform really well requires that you kind of sway your abilities in one direction. But Louis took a little bit of an issue with this because people get hurt when they have a low general physical preparedness, okay? So your sprint mechanics probably didn't change during quarantine, did they? No, but you didn't want to pull a hamstring because why? You weren't in great shape coming out of sitting on your butt for 4 months. Yeah. So, in daily undulating periodization, just because I want to make sure I stay on time here. What we're looking at is everything that we just went over with linear periodization, building up, coming down and deloading, building up, coming down and deloading. Louis was like, screw it. It's outdated. We don't need it. Why climb the mountain when you're just going to come back down, right, and start over, right? So Louis thinks that linear periodization is dead. Kind of, if you really read into what he writes and what he looks at, maybe not 100% true. But his whole thing was develop every quality simultaneous, right? So develop your speed, explosiveness. If you really look at anatomical, or not anatomical, but strength adaptations, we have several different ones that we can break out. You have strength speed, which is the ability to move moderate weights quickly. We have speed strength, which is the ability to move light weights quickly. We have absolute strength, which is the total amount of force that you can apply. And then obviously you have explosiveness and explosive power. So Louis would change how you would do a linear periodization. So when we look at linear, you might have cycles where you say, okay, well, we went through an anatomical or hypertrophy mesocycle. So we went through, 3 to 4 weeks of hypertrophy. We went through 3 to 4, maybe 8 to 9, 10 to 12 weeks of max strength. Then we'd go into power development. Then we'd go to power endurance, being able to continually output power. And then we'd maintain all that for a season or peak for a season. Louis decided that he was going to turn this upside down on his head, and a lot of it was based off of Russian textbooks and Russian sports science. But they have a max strength day. They have what they call recovery sessions. They have power days. They have days where it's relative strength, and then they have days where they work on power endurance. What that looks like in a actual week, right? And I'm just going to be very honest. I'm not this isn't my forte. I toy around with this a little bit right now in myself, but one of the things that we look at when you look at training is at some point your nervous system has to stop sending signals to your muscles. It can't recover, right? And there's literally a phrase, if you look at the book that Louis wrote, that all this is kind of derived from, the same sentence is put 3 times in 3 pages of text. If you train at 90% or more for 3 consecutive weeks, the nervous system fatigues and your performance will decrease. Literally says that verbatim 3 times in 3 pages, right? But then he says we're going to max out every single week. And so how they do that is by changing how you apply force. So basically when we look at, per se, a undulating plan throughout the week,